Hello my beautiful watchers and welcome back to Lost in Adaptation and my review of the Scott Pilgrim film adaptation. This episode is going to focus on volume 2 of the 6 comic books that were the basis for the movie. And to address some of your comments, yes, the Scott Pilgrimage would have been a better name than the Scott Pilgrimathon, but what you have to take into account is... shut up. If you've arrived at this video without having watched the previous installment for whatever reason, possibly because this is the only volume that matches the title of the film, so it might have gotten a slight algorithm boost, might I humbly suggest starting at the beginning of these reviews via the handy thing up there. According to my estimates, 23% of the film's runtime was allocated to cover the events of this volume, and there's actually enough book loyalty in this part of the film that I might have been tempted to do this as a regular episode. However, just as a reminder, I am utilising the in-name only format because of the chicken and the egg situation this adaptation has put me in. Because of the timing of their release, I don't know exactly how much of any of the volumes past the first one the filmmakers had complete access to, or how much the author of the books was influenced by the pre-production of the film he was so involved with. Claiming that the filmmakers changed something just isn't provable in this case, so let's take a judgment-free look at both and see when they aligned and when they diverged, starting with the film because that appears to be the version more people are familiar with. In the corresponding section of the film, Scott arrives back home, apparently having chosen to focus on the positive Ramona makeouts and not the negative impending fights to the death he must face in order to date her. So much so, he doesn't even mention the man he just killed to his awesome roommate Wallace in his initial progress report. Wallace, tired of Scott's shit, gives him the ultimatum that he must break up with Knives before continuing his relationship with Ramona, or he will spill the beans about his double timing. Scott reluctantly agrees and goes to find his young girlfriend while Wallace watches a movie marathon starring upcoming actor Lucas Lee, a handsome devil currently shooting a movie in Toronto. Scott, lacking a cell phone, which was kind of lame even in 2010 now that I think about it, calls Knives from a phone booth and is surprised that she's right behind him. While he stalls for time working up the guts to break up with her, she invites him to her birthday dinner at her parents' house and confesses her love for him. Plowing ahead with his awfulness, Scott breaks up with her anyway, visibly breaking her heart. To his credit, his guilt over this lasts almost half of the bus ride home. Later that day, Scott informs his band of his change in relationship status, earning more accusations against the virtue of his character from Kim. Then, much to Stephen Still's annoyance, Scott skips out on practice altogether to be with his new girlfriend, leaving young Neil to play bass instead of him. Scott seems overly fixated on Ramona's sudden change in hair colour, terrified of what it would mean for him if she's this changeable about everything in life. Wallace heads off to stalk Lucas Lee at a nearby castle he's filming at, telling Scott to come and find him there if his date goes horribly wrong. After a homemade garlic bread meal, things do indeed start to go horribly wrong as Ramona makes an innocuous comment about Scott's hair, which triggers a traumatic memory for him about his really bad breakup from the year before. In an attempt to derail the subject, he leads Ramona to the castle the film is being shot at, which turns out to be a terrible error as Lucas Lee is revealed to be Ramona's second evil ex-boyfriend. While he is super arrogant, he doesn't actually seem to be all that evil, but still beats the crap out of Scott. He not only appears physically superior to him, but also has a team of stunt doubles that can fight for him while he goes for coffee. Seemingly unable to overcome him, Scott resorts to trickery and goads Lucas into doing a suicidally dangerous skateboard stunt down some stairs, resulting in a fatal crash. Discovering that Ramona bailed on him mid-fight, Scott returns home depressed, a situation made worse by a call from Envy Adams, aka Natalie, aka the girl who dumped him for a guy named Todd, then became a super famous singer. Then made worse again when Knives shows up looking for him, forcing him to bail rather than deal with her. While wandering through town, he is set upon by a shadowy attacker, who turns out to be of the female persuasion. He tells her that he's not really in the mood for whatever it is she's doing, and for some reason she respects this and vows to come back later. Well, I say for some reason. The reason is this is an event from the comics, but from a much later volume that they've moved to earlier in the story, so it wouldn't have made any sense for them to fight once you find out who this character is. Scott tries to seek advice from his little sister at her coffee shop workplace, but finds his bitchy friend Julie instead. She's pissed at him for asking Ramona out when she forbid it, and is somehow able to censor herself so she can swear at work. He runs into Ramona, who apologizes for ditching him and offers him an out from dating her, which he refuses. Then things are made infinitely more anxiety-inducing for him by the arrival of Envy Adams, who, in an unnecessarily condescending way, invites Scott to her gig that her band is playing in Toronto, which he also refuses. Scott and Ramona exchange stories about bad exes, and Ramona, apparently feeling closer to Scott because of their mutually sucky past, suggests they go back to her place place. Scott apparently declines as he's got too much envy on his mind. On the advice of Wallace's boyfriend also called Scott, and Stacy's former boyfriend, now Wallace's other boyfriend, Scott vows to no longer obsess over his ex, only to immediately discover that Steve Stills accepted her request that Sex Bomb open for them at their gig on the weekend. Scott is understandably displeased. Meanwhile, it seems that Knives has not taken their breakup well and is stalking Scott. Seeing that he's with Ramona now, she freaks out, dyes her hair partly blue to look more like her, and swears revenge and whatnot. Sex Bomb kind of bombs at the gig, Knives turns up and is apparently dating young Neil now, and to round off the awful, in an unlikely coincidence, it turns out that Todd, Envy's bassist and boyfriend, is Ramona's third evil ex. Okay, now let's see how things went down in the comic book. Volume 2 of the comic starts with a flashback to Scott's high school days when he just transferred to a new school somewhere in the northy bit of Canada. He gets into a fight on his first day and ends up meeting a girl called Lisa Miller, who insinuates herself into his life somewhat against his will, though he does come to appreciate their friendship after a while. Lisa seemingly arbitrarily decides they should start a band. Scott is partnered with Kim during class and discovers that she can play the drums. They also seem to have a good amount of chemistry, and he confesses to Lisa that he thinks he likes her. However, before he can tell her this or ask her to join his band, she is apparently kidnapped by a rival school, so he has to go and rescue her from an army of kids and a guy called Simon who can do shit with lightning, maybe, but Scott kicks his ass and saves Kim. The rest of the intro montages through everything being pretty cool for young Scott, until his family move to Toronto and he has to leave Kim and Lisa behind. The comic then segues to Ramona passing through Scott's dreams again, saying hi and telling him to get the fuck out of bed already. Later, Scott and Wallace are on a bus, expositioning that it's almost springtime now in the comic's timeline. Wallace gives Scott the ultimatum that he has to break up with Knives or he's going to tell Ramona that he's two-timing her, then springs on him at the last minute that he's going to be having lots of sex with a guy in their bed later, so he can't come home. Annoyed, Scott goes in search of Knives, calling her from a payphone and discovering she's right outside. They hang out for a bit while he stalls for time, working up the guts to break up with her. She unexpectedly invites him round to dinner at her place to meet her parents, then confesses her love for him. Just like in the film, Scott breaks up with her anyway, visibly breaking her heart, getting over his guilt super fast, informing his band and being told he's kind of a scumbag. Later that day, Ramona arrives at Scott's home for dinner. Scott is momentarily surprised that Ramona got a haircut, but pretends to like it. Ramona is mildly worried to find out that her new boyfriend lives in a one-room apartment, but is impressed that he can single-handedly cook a complex fancy dinner for two. Later, during a makeout session, she mentions his hair is getting kind of shaggy and he has his haircut freakout. The point of view character for the comic then briefly switches to Kim as she has a dream that the guy who kidnapped her in high school killed Scott, but she's not particularly cut up about it. Kim, seems to have had a few issues in the comic. She gets ready to go to work and you see that she absolutely hates her roommates and claims that she hates her workmates too, but in more of a not really, it's just banter, they secretly get on kind of way. Apparently she works at some sort of Blockbusters-esque video store. I don't know if this is a completely made up thing or a Canadian thing. Scott arrives and requests 5 movies, all starring the same actor, Lucas Lee, who Wallace has discovered is Ramona's second evil ex. Scott is attempting to prepare himself for their fight by watching all of his films. Cutting briefly to Ramona, she goes into a coffee shop and happens to meet Scott's sister, something he spidey senses with some dread. Wallace is apparently personally training him for the upcoming battle, but in a sort of lazy, slightly disinterested sort of way. Let's see, a lot of stuff happens in quick succession here. Steve Stills and the rest of Sex Bomb are fairly tactless in talking about how successful Scott's ex-Envy has become. Ramona and Scott spend some quality time together. Knives turns up at Scott's house and Wallace has to ask her to leave. Ramona watches some of Lucas's movies with Scott, kind of showing how few shit she gives about the guy, though her head does start glowing again for some reason. Scott's parents call from Rome in the middle of the night. Ramona hangs out with a band and they do like a group bonding cooking session thing while Knives is seen spying on them from outside the window. She freaks out and highlights her hair, though you'll notice it's a different colour to Ramona's in the comic. And Ramona gets a cat that she calls Gideon for unknown and confusing reasons. Finally, Scott makes his way to the castle to meet Lucas for their battle, though he seems more concerned about his hair than his possible impending death. Lucas is just sort of chilling there, and when Scott introduces himself, he just sort of lazily knocks him down and then throws him into the castle. When he realizes the power disparity between them, he suggests taking a break and having lunch first. They make small talk about the League of Evil Exes and his film career, then Lucas reveals that Ramona really broke his heart by cheating on him then dumping him, something that surprises Scott, who seems to have been under the impression that she was a better person than that. Lucas offers to just pretend that they had a fight, but Scott just can't stop himself from being a dick, which changes his mind. Fortunately, he manages to goad Lucas into performing the suicidal grind down the stair rail and getting himself killed before he can destroy him. Ramona turns up at this point, apparently not caring about Lucas enough to come and say hi to him before the battle. Sometime later, Scott wanders into a coffee shop looking for his sister, but finds his bitchy friend Julie instead, who tells him that Stacy is hanging out with Ramona today. Also that Scott's ex is in town and looking to talk to him. Both pieces of information shock and appall Scott. Meanwhile, Ramona and Stacy are at a big fancy Canadian library. Knives makes an unexpected appearance, attacking Ramona with knives and accusing her of stealing her boyfriend. Ramona defends herself with a variety of objects until Knives gives up and runs away. Stacy explains that Knives and Scott dated briefly, though she assumes that he broke up with her before asking Ramona out and just forgot to tell anyone. And later, Scott is at home and gets a call from Envy. She asks what would seem like normal catch-up questions, though Scott is suspicious. She requests that his band open for hers at their gig in town, as someone had to cancel on them at the last minute. Wallace returns home to find Scott comatose on the floor. He accepts Envy calling as an acceptable justification for this. Can we all just take a second to acknowledge what an awesome friend Wallace is, both in the comic and the film? Everyone should have a Wallace in their lives. Scott grudgingly informs the band of the potential gig, and Stacy tells Scott about the incident with Knives. Said incident doesn't seem to have bothered Ramona too much, and in contrast to the last volume, she seems to be way more into Scott now. She asks for Envy's backstory, and he explains how she left him for a guy he'd never met called Todd. Ramona mentions she dated a Todd once, and jokes that it might be the same guy. Scott also talks about the last job he had, which was apparently at a restaurant he really loved, but it got shut down. He claims he was actually really gutted about it. Sex Bob-omb is apparently reconnoitering a Saturday performance in the venue they're going to be playing at on the Sunday. Knives is there with young Neil, and Kim meets up with her co-worker Holly and her gay roommate Joseph, who is just as sassy but a bit more grumpy than Wallace. Envy's band, the Clash at Demon Head, come on stage, and Ramona realizes that the bass player really is, against all the odds, the Todd she dated, her third evil ex-boyfriend. The Dom's final thoughts. So I would say most of what we saw here was small but reasonably accurate selections from the comics, surrounded by a shit ton the film left out. Once again, you can see pages where it shows that O'Malley was thinking more about a film than a comic, and they end up working much better with rights directing and editing than they did in art form. There's not as many as in Volume 1, but there's still a good amount of astonishingly similar shots in the film and panels in the comic. The only really big difference in any of the scenes that were directly adapted from the book is the direction they chose to go in with Lucas Lee. He's basically a completely different person in the film. If you were to put a +1 katana to my head and demand an answer, I would probably say that I liked the film version of him more. I kind of just feel bad for the comic version of him, and that makes me sad, but the super full of himself yet somehow really likable film version played by Chris Evans is fucking hilarious and way more memorable. There's a lot of seemingly pointless scenes in the comic that don't really go anywhere or contribute anything to the main plot, but I think that in of itself is kind of the point of them. It's not all business in the comics, and it's especially not just about Scott versus the evil exes. That's just the most important overarching storyline. A huge part of these comics is just these guys living their lives, world and character building, stuff that gets you invested so you're genuinely unhappy when things go wrong for them, be it emotionally or death battle-y. This is not the last season change in the comics. There's multiple time jumps of varying length throughout and in between them. I'll talk more about how this affects the adaptation in the final thoughts. The first volume of the comic showed some examples of Scott's terrible memory, but this one really starts to drive home that the dude's recall is scarily bad. He cannot remember jack shit about anything. As someone who is also notorious for this, I am relating to Scott Pilgrim again. I promised myself I wasn't going to do that anymore. The comic also shows us just how much of a passenger Scott has been on the journey of his own life. The only thing he gives a shit about when he's an adult, besides his womanizing, is his band, and we find out that forming one in the first place wasn't his idea, or something he was even particularly interested in at first. The friends that he has apparently just dropped into his life, with his only contribution to the relationship being not objecting particularly hard to it. Bringing Roxy into the story early is harmless enough because she didn't end up doing anything, and it can be explained away as her getting impatient for her turn, jumping the line, then having second thoughts when she finds out that Scott isn't a complete pushover. I'm actually kind of glad they fudged it to give her a little more screen time, considering like 90% of her storyline from book 4 was omitted. We'll get to that. It's amusing to me that a bit later the film implies that Scott claiming that he had to fight an army and a mini-boss in order to date Kim was him being sarcastic about all the crap he's having to go through for Ramona, when that actually happened in the comic. Sort of. We'll get to that too. That the Knives-Ramona confrontation took place here instead of in the climax was another early warning sign to me that the films and the comics were about to start going in their individual directions soon. So yeah, please do join me next time as we work our way ever closer to that parting of the ways. I hope you'll forgive me for mentioning this every single time, but please remember that the YouTube algorithm gives about as much of a shit about the quality of the videos being uploaded to it as Ramona gave about Lucas Lee, but it does like to promote videos that get a lot of likes and comments on it, so if you did like this episode, please don't be afraid to show it. See you soon, my beautiful watchers. Hello again, my beautiful watchers. I just wanted to take this opportunity to give you a quick reminder that there's a wonderful website called Patreon that's been allowing online producers to actually make a living doing what they do, since apparently YouTube's decided that they shouldn't anymore. Basically, they offer the chance to pledge a certain amount of money per month or per video in exchange for various rewards offered by the creator. There's a variety of stuff you can earn by becoming one of my patrons, including early access to all videos and taking part in that survey you see at the start of every Lost in Adaptation episode. That's actually a very important part of the process, as I use it to gauge how much I'm going to need to explain about the book and the film before I start comparing them. If you decide to become a higher level contributor, your name will be added to the credits that you're seeing right now, and you'll be given the option to join my private chat room so you can regularly talk with me and other patrons. If you're keen enough to join the topmost tier of patronage, you'll earn the most coveted of all the rewards, the chance to pick a future adaptation to be reviewed by yours truly. However, if right now you are thinking, my goodness the Dom, I can't do that, I was going to. I found a magic lamp that granted me 3 wishes, and I meant to wish for infinite wealth, but, well, long story short, I have 3 jetpacks now. Fear not, it would still be a huge help to me if you were to give that like button the old clickaroo, share this episode on social media with perhaps a little recommendation to your friends to check it out, and subscribe if you've not already. It really helps my channel grow and reach new beautiful watchers. I hope you have a most pleasant day, and I will see you in the next episode.